Hello, everyone who's joined us so far. Welcome to our webinar presented by Preti, Flaherty, and KMA Human Resources. We're going to wait just a minute or two to actually get started because we know at high noon people kind of drift in. So we're going to try and give a few more people a chance to drift in, and then we'll get started. Thank you for your patience. Okay, well, I guess we will get going. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar about the crisis of the She-cession. I'm Rhoda McVeigh. I'm the Director of Consulting Services for KMA Human Resources Consulting. And KMA Human Resources Consulting works with successful and growing businesses throughout New England. We are your partner for managing and growing your most valuable resource, your people. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping here. This webinar is really designed as a conversation, so we don't have an actual deck per se. We'll be showing a few graphics here and there throughout, but this is a conversation between Laura and me. And we welcome and encourage your questions throughout. If you'll put them in the chat function there that you see on your screen, we'll get to as many as we can during the webinar and at the end of the webinar as well. And as you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has uniquely and negatively impacted women in the workforce. According to the National Women's Law Center, women have lost 5.4 million jobs since the pandemic began. And that is a huge number. And female-dominated industries have been particularly hit hard, and the support system that women rely on has collapsed as well, childcare, support of that nature. And in this conversation, we're going to talk about the crisis that is dubbed the She-cession, and explore some ways employers can address it head-on the rest of this year and really help those women stay in or get back into the workplace. So joining me today for this discussion is Laura Rideout. Laura is an attorney with Preti, Flaherty in the Portland, Maine office. She is a partner of the firm's Employment Law and Litigation Practice Group. As a member of the firm's employment law team, she regularly advises employers on a wide range of issues. Preti Flaherty is a deliberately different law firm of 100 attorneys with 4 New England locations and an office in Washington, D.C. So thanks for joining us today, Laura.
Thanks for having me. So I'm very happy to be here with you all this afternoon. I've spoken on topics related to gender equality over the past few years. And it's a topic that I not only have an academic curiosity about, but it's something that I have a professional interest in, as Rhoda mentioned. I advise clients on these topics every day. I defend clients who are facing sex discrimination or harassment types of claims. I investigate those types of claims. But it's also something that I have a personal interest in. I'm a mom. I have 2 young children under the age of 4. In fact, their daycare is closed today because of this lovely weather we are having. And so I ventured into my office so that I don't have a BBC Dad moment now. If you don't know what BBC Dad is, I encourage you to Google it after our presentation. Unfortunately, my husband had the ability to work remotely today so that I could be here in my office free of distraction. But, you know, it's not a distant memory for me to be a pregnant employee or to be a breastfeeding employee and to sort of face these issues, not only from the employee standpoint, but from the employer standpoint as well. So I really look forward to have the opportunity to sort of look at these existing gender equality issues, and then sort of examine how the pandemic has exacerbated these existing problems.
Well, that's great, Laura. And you know, I commend all of you working mothers. My children are grown and on their own at this point, but I just don't know how the women who have children in full-time jobs have been doing it. It's just amazing. And so I commend all of you. So let's get right into some questions here. Tell us a little bit, Laura, about how has the pandemic impacted gender equality in the workplace?
So we've all seen these headlines about this labor market crisis that's being referred to as the She-cession. It's been studied extensively over the last year. So we're fortunate in that we have a lot of very good sources of information putting out data and statistics about how the pandemic has impacted gender equality in the workplace. Rhoda, you mentioned earlier a statistic from the National Women's Law Center. There are similar statistics from other organizations. So for example, the International Labor Organization, which is a UN agency that sets standards for promoting decent working standards for men and women, that organization is reporting that 140 million full-time jobs might be lost due to COVID-19, and women's employment is 19% more at risk than men's employment. There's also been a lot of buzz about what's being referred to as the McKinsey study, and I'm sure many of our participants here today have heard about the McKinsey study. For those of you that haven't, McKinsey Global Institute is a private sector think tank that looks at industry trends and then tries to understand them from a macroeconomic perspective and sort of looking at how to put together business strategy or policy change proposals to address these types of impacts. And so McKinsey looked at the pandemic and how it is affecting gender equality and concluded that women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable to crisis than men's jobs are.
Why is that, Laura? How does that impact women in that way?
So there's kind of two main reasons here, and you've touched on both of them in your opening remarks. The first, I think, is the fact that men and women, and this is a pre-COVID phenomenon where men and women tend to cluster into different industries and different occupations. And it just so happens that these social distancing guidelines have more heavily hit those industries and professions that are more typically occupied by women than men. So hospitality, food service, retail, entertainment, those are the industries that are struggling the most, and those are the industries that are more heavily concentrated with female employees. In fact, I think 3 out of 4 of the most heavily affected sectors more heavily employ women, the exception being manufacturing, which has been very heavily hit, and manufacturing is more traditionally concentrated with male employees.
Sure, absolutely. And should we be worried about this as employers?
Absolutely. You know, and that's part of the problem. So obviously when these industries are impacted, if businesses are hard hit, then we are at risk for layoffs, we are at risk for furloughs, our employees are feeling financial insecurity and stress and worry, and we'll get into why those are things that employers should be worried about and should want to sort of try to take efforts to address to the extent possible later on in the presentation today. The other issue that I want to talk about regarding why women are impacted more significantly than men is this double shift problem. And again, this is a problem that was pre-existing, this concept of double shift work. It's just the case that in society, on average, women tend to shoulder the burden of domestic work or caregiving responsibilities more than men do. And that's not to say that, you know, there are certainly families out there with a more equal division of labor, but that's not the norm yet. And so women have traditionally shouldered these childcare obligations, obligations related to education or other domestic tasks more heavily than men. And pre-COVID, the UN reports that women spent an average of 4.1 hours per day performing those types of unpaid tasks, while men spent just 1.7 hours per day doing so. And of course, what's happened with the COVID pandemic is that it's completely destabilized our countries and or globally the education system and the childcare system. And so this is resulting in a very significant and problematic increase in those responsibilities. And because women tend to perform more of those tasks, the responsibilities are falling disproportionately on women to sort of pick up the slack there. Lean In reports that moms are 1.5 times more likely than dads to spend an extra 3 hours a day on housework and childcare. And this is equal to 20 hours a week or half of a full-time job. And the challenge is even more significant for the 1 in 5 moms who don't have a spouse or a partner. So this is just an extra amount of work that's being put on working mothers, and it's contributing to fatigue, exhaustion, and burnout. And again, we'll talk about this later on in the presentation, but it's putting women's employment at risk.
Yeah, did we have a graphic we wanted to share about this?
Absolutely. Amber, would you mind turning to slide 2?
Here we go. That's the one you wanted to show, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a graphic put together by the Boston Consulting Group after a survey of caregivers during the pandemic. And this is really interesting because it's reporting that 60% of working parents don't have outside help in caring for and educating their children. So once you take away school, once you take away daycare centers, most people are left with nothing. And so they're trying to handle those responsibilities themselves. And that's leading to an additional 27 hours a week of work that has to be squeezed in with a full-time job. And women are shouldering the burden more heavily than men. As I mentioned, this study is reporting women are doing 15 more hours of work a week than men are on domestic labor. And this matters because women are worried that their performance is suffering as a result of having to pick up the slack on these additional responsibilities.
My gosh, yeah. But men are increasingly sharing more of the responsibilities in the home as well. And should we be concerned about working parents in general?
That's a great question, Rhoda. And absolutely, you know, this isn't exclusively a women's issue. We need to be thinking about men too. And there are implicit biases in the workplace, obviously, that impact women and are part of a problem here. For example, you know, women who are mothers are not perceived as being as committed to their careers as men are. And so this is especially a problem when women take advantage of flex time policies or that type of thing. It tends to reinforce these existing implicit biases. And as a result, women who are mothers are potentially perceived more negatively than fathers are, or women who do not have children. But we have to remember that there is implicit bias that impacts men too. And men are seen in society as the breadwinners and not as well equipped to handle these childcare responsibilities. And so if they act in a way that sort of goes against this norm or this attitude that exists, then they could be perceived negatively for doing so. Interestingly enough, however, the studies show that men don't necessarily worry about that as much as women do. Women are more concerned that they're being perceived negatively for performing childcare responsibilities than men do, but the bias does exist and it is having an effect. And not to get political or anything, but President Trump made a remark at a rally in Michigan saying, "Don't worry, we're going to get your husbands back to work." And so that kind of shows exactly what we're dealing with in society in terms of how these biases work. So bottom line, yes, we need to worry about moms and dads who have childcare responsibilities and who are trying to make it work during the pandemic. And some of the initiatives that we're going to be talking about to sort of help mitigate some of these problems are going to apply equally in the workforce. But we can't lose sight of the fact that we have all of this information and data telling us that women are being hit harder than men. We can't ignore it, and we have to sort of factor that into our decision making.
Yeah, yeah. And we have a graphic about this as well, right, with the men and women in terms of
status. We do. We actually have a lot of interesting graphics about that. So let's back up and Amber, thanks for turning to this slide. Let's look at this one. So this is a slide sort of highlighting why this is a problem that we need to be focusing on. So some people might be thinking, okay, COVID-19, it's a pandemic. Isn't this temporary? There's light at the end of the tunnel. We have this vaccine that's in distribution right now. Why are we up in arms over something that is going to work itself out, in short order? And the bottom line is we don't know that that's the case. We don't know when things are going to go back to normal, if they ever do go completely back to normal. But why this is such a problem is that even a year of regression in terms of progress that has been made in gender equality is something that is incredibly harmful. And what this particular figure shows, which is very interesting, is that progress on gender equality has actually stagnated over the last 5 years in the workforce. And so we see in the bottom half of this graph that if we look at metrics of gender equality in society, we've had some progress. So for example, maternal mortality rates have gone down and women are better represented in state and federal government than they were before. So we have these positive developments. If we look at the metrics that are used to assess gender equality in the workforce, we're not seeing, as many positive improvements, and things are pretty much staying the same. So we have a very similar labor force participation rate between female and male participants as we did 5 years ago now. We have a similar ratio of men and women in leadership positions as we did 5 years ago. And so the problem is, if this pandemic causes us to slide backwards, we're really losing some, and we didn't have a whole lot of momentum to begin with, and maybe this is a good opportunity for us to try to reignite some momentum.
Good point. And we have another slide also, right, related to this demographic?
Yes, so why don't we take a look at slide 4. So this is an interesting slide. This is kind of getting at the topic that I just spoke about, which is that women and men are sort of perceiving the same situations differently, or reporting different answers to these types of questions that we're talking about. So this is looking at the percent of employees who consider changing their work situation because of COVID-19. And we're seeing that fathers and mothers are both having these thoughts occur to them. But we're seeing a larger number of women who are considering reducing the number of hours that they're working, or whether they want to try changing careers and find something that's less demanding, whether it makes sense for them to sort of pull back from the workforce temporarily, or pull back altogether. There are more women having these thoughts and taking these actions than men, which is a problem. Amber, can you please turn to the next slide? So this one is looking at the difference between senior level women and senior level men. And what I like about this slide is it's showing that, this is looking at burnout, and it's showing that senior level women feel more pressure to work more. They feel more exhausted and they feel more burnt out. So presumably this is because they're shouldering a greater burden of those childcare responsibilities that we talked about. And Amber, if you turn to the next slide, it sort of underscores that point. This is showing that if you look at the bottom half of this graph, about 50% of mothers are saying that they're responsible for most of the work in the household or all of the work in the household. So, these figures really sort of highlight the parameters of the problem. And another slide I want to look at, Amber, if you could go to the next one. I wanted to make the point that women, it's not a one-size-fits-all experience for women. This is a really interesting image because it not only compares all men against all women, but then it breaks down the experiences of white women, Black women, Asian women, Latinas, LGBTQ plus women, and women with disabilities, and shows that all of these different subclasses of women are reporting, different reactions to feeling stressed out, feeling exhausted, feeling burned out because of what the pandemic is doing. So it's important to keep that in mind, that the experience is not the same for everyone.
Well, Laura, is this a policy issue or is this something that business leaders really need to be addressing in their own companies?
That's a great question, and really it's both. So what we have here is a situation where we don't necessarily have policies in place that are addressing the source of the problem. We talked about the fact that the educational system and the childcare system in our country became very unreliable over the past year. There were long stretches of time where there was no school, where there was no childcare. For some people, that is still the case. For some people like myself, we just take it one day at a time. And, you know, we know that any day we could get that email saying that somebody tested positive and the facility is closed for a few weeks. And it doesn't matter what obligations we had in our calendar to attend to. We just have to sort of make it work the best we can. A lot of people are in those situations. And so certainly policies that were in place to create, you know, state-funded solutions for childcare or to professionalize the childcare industry with public funding could potentially go a long way to helping the workforce navigate these challenges. There could be tax policies that incentivize both men and women to be in the workforce, that sort of thing. But we see this all the time where oftentimes the private sector bridges the gap when there is a lag in public support for these types of problems. And we see companies that want to be competitive in their market and they want to recruit and retain the best talent that they can. They start adopting some of these progressive policies and bridge the gap. And then we see more progressive states decide that they're going to adopt laws that sort of mimic what's happening in the private sector. And then a ripple effect happens where those laws become adopted by a growing number of states. And we see positive change on a policy level that matches what businesses started doing on their own terms beforehand. And a really good example of that is paid leave policies. At the federal level, we don't have a paid leave policy that applies to private sector employees. But what we did see is that obviously, you know, a lot of businesses and companies and organizations offered paid leave as part of their benefits package. And that's something that became expected for the workforce. And so, you know, eventually states started implementing those types of laws too. And we have a growing number of states that have either paid sick leave, paid family and medical leave, or like Maine, we have a new earned paid leave benefit that can be used for basically any purpose whatsoever. So there is room for that type of work to be done, I think, here to address some of these challenges associated with COVID-19, where we'll see organizations and companies and businesses sort of take the lead on providing some of these resources, whether it's child support resources or, you know, homeschooling support resources or other wellness types of benefits to sort of bridge the gap and make the workforce more sustainable.
So we have a question here, which you spoke to earlier, Laura, about the stagnation of the growth of women and equality in the workplace. There's a question that says, is the reason for this stagnation of growth due to people feeling we have achieved equality in the workplace and are not pushing for it as much?
That's a really good question. I honestly don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts that you want to chime in with, Rhoda, but I honestly don't know how to explain the stagnation that we've seen. You know, it's really interesting. I think we made a lot of progress really fast if you compare, you know, the previous decades, and maybe that's just a natural effect as we start to sort of homogenize a little bit and slow down. I think we have to examine the underlying forces that are sort of preventing us from making additional progress in that regard and see if there's ways to, you know, and that's going to examine like what types of fields of study are women going into, and, you know, what are those motivating forces that are sort of preventing us from moving forward.
Right, and I know, you know, in the human resources world, you know, we see certain industries that are more willing to be flexible with women as well as the men in the workplace relative to their family needs, their working situation, that kind of thing, or offer more paid leave in the tech industry to attract the top talent. So I know we're hopeful that more and more industries will understand this need in order, like Laura said, to really attract top talent and retain them. Because that's key to doing that is being flexible with people and their individual needs, because it is not one size fits all, as Laura said earlier. No question about that. So, Laura, so far, have you seen any type of COVID-related discrimination lawsuits filed on behalf of any female workers or women employees anywhere?
Yeah, so what I want to talk about here is really, I wouldn't say COVID-19 is creating any class of claims. What it's doing is it's exacerbating circumstances or scenarios that already existed that could lead to potential claims. So for example, federal EEO laws don't prohibit discrimination against caregivers per se, but there are circumstances when discriminating against a caregiver could constitute unlawful disparate treatment under one of these laws. Obviously, where we have a situation when our employees, men and women, are shouldering more caregiving responsibilities, there is a heightened risk of these types of issues manifesting themselves. So the EEOC has some guidance on this, which is interesting, and sort of gives a preview of what type of evidence investigators may be looking for to find evidence of this type of disparate treatment. When looking at whether a female caregiver is being discriminated against, investigators would be looking at whether female employees or job applicants are being asked questions about their caregiver responsibilities when male employees are not, whether there are stereotypical comments or derogatory comments being made about pregnant workers or working mothers or female caregivers, whether female employees are being given less favorable treatment as soon as it becomes known that they have assumed these caregiving responsibilities, even if their performance hasn't declined. Are women being treated, less favorably given less responsibility because they have caregiving responsibilities when you compare it to women who don't have caregiving responsibilities or male employees? Are these women being steered towards or assigned less prestigious opportunities or, less bonus opportunity, lower paying positions, that type of thing? Or are we treating male workers with caregiving responsibilities more favorably than women with caregiving responsibilities? And this is all true for males with caregiving responsibilities, true. And the investigators in those circumstances would be looking at, are employers denying men who request leave for childcare purposes when female requests are being granted and that sort of thing? So that's something to be aware of. There can also be a hostile work environment claim angle here. And again, caregiving isn't a protected class under these laws, but employers could, in some scenario have liability if workers with caregiving responsibilities are being subjected to offensive comments or harassment because of race or sex or association with an individual with a disability. Or another protected characteristic if that conduct is sufficiently severe or pervasive and is creating a hostile work environment. And so, it's hard to thread the needle. I think best practices indicate, regardless of whether or not a caregiver is a protected class, we're being sort of signaled that it could fit in under, some factual scenario that may play out in this pandemic. And best practices would probably indicate that we exercise great caution and try not to, treat people with caregiving responsibilities differently if their performance is still up to par and they're meeting expectations otherwise. The other area we've seen a little bit of an uptick in is pregnancy discrimination claims since the onset of COVID-19. COVID obviously presents an elevated risk to pregnant women. And pregnant employees are pursuing claims against their employers if their employers have declined to give them what they perceive to be a reasonable accommodation. So that's something to tread carefully around. I think it really is manifesting itself in industries where pregnant employees are sort of on the front lines of dealing with either people who are COVID positive or have been exposed to COVID. So healthcare workers certainly and that sort of thing. But it really suggests that it's important to exercise diligence when responding to employees' requests for accommodations due to COVID-19 when they do have an underlying health condition, including pregnancy, and to really take care to document those requests and whatever efforts were made to handle those requests for accommodations. Something else to sort of be aware of is the possibility for a sex plus discrimination claim. Studies are showing that the unemployment rates for women who are over the age of 55 have expanded dramatically after COVID-19. So that makes me wonder, you know, could there be potential age discrimination, sex discrimination combined claims? Who knows? It's just something to maybe keep track of and keep our finger on the pulse of. But the bottom line here is really that all of these EEO laws continue to apply during the pandemic, but they don't interfere with employers from following whatever recommendations are coming out from the CDC or other state and local public health authorities.
And I know sometimes with some employers that I've dealt with in the past that they'll make assumptions for a pregnant woman in terms of what she can or can't do and that kind of thing versus engaging with her in terms of how can we support you? What do you need? Let's figure this out, that kind of thing.
Yep, that's exactly right. I've seen that a lot myself where very well-meaning and well-intentioned people want to sort of do their employee a favor and relieve them of these obligations that they don't see as compatible with a pregnancy, and really that can be discriminatory. We can't just, you know, preemptively take away job responsibilities or advantages of employment on behalf of our pregnant employees because we think that's the right thing to do, and it does need to be something that's communicated appropriately with the employee to sort of have the right decision making happening.
Sure, sure. And we have a question here from Sherry. Are you seeing a trend that women are choosing to permanently exit the workforce as a result of all this?
Yes, we are seeing that. So I think one of the statistics that Rhoda mentioned earlier was that over 5 million female jobs have been impacted by the pandemic. And I've seen reported in numerous sources that about around 2 million of those jobs, the women are not actively looking to re-enter the workforce. And so that's suggesting to me that there's something going on for women that's preventing them from trying to re-enter the workforce. And I'm guessing it's probably in most cases the fact that they have these childcare responsibilities, like their kids are doing remote learning or they don't have reliable childcare anymore, and the burden is making it difficult to conceive of re-entering the workforce in a meaningful way, at least for the short-term future.
Yeah, and as I recall, I believe if people stop even looking for a job, they're left out of those unemployment numbers going forward because they're not even searching. So it might be understated to a certain extent as well.
That's my understanding too.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, Laura, what can managers do to promote gender equality, better gender equality in the workplace? Managers below even the C-suite level.
So if you don't mind if I back up a little bit before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about, why we've talked about what the problem is and why this is happening. Why is there a she-cession happening? I want to talk about first, before we get into what we can do about it, why we should do something about it. Why should we be taking these efforts? And I think the first one is that it's good for organizations to have diversity among their ranks. Studies show that organizations that have women well represented throughout various tenure bands tend to outperform their peers by as much as 50%. So we can't ignore that. It's good for the bottom line. And so we don't have to be altruistic. We can do it, for the benefit of our organizations. Studies also show that there is a cultural impact on organizations when they have diversity in their workforce and they have women in their workforce. Women are more likely than men to embrace employee-friendly policies and family-friendly policies. They are more likely to champion racial and gender diversity than their male counterparts. And they are more likely to mentor and sponsor women, which helps ensure that there is this constant pipeline of women throughout the ranks within an organization, which is really important. There are also economic impacts that are important to consider, looking at a broader perspective. Women are increasingly, or the income that women bring to the table is increasingly important in families in our country. There's a lot of families that are dual income. And if you take away one of those incomes, it's less resources for the family. So that is going to impact financial stability going forward. It's going to deplete savings. It's going to reduce the purchasing power of these families. And that's going to trickle down and affect our local economy, where we don't have as many people supporting local restaurants during the pandemic. And we don't have as many people supporting local businesses during the pandemic. Maybe it's easier and less expensive to use Amazon or big box or whatnot, as opposed to, helping to support these smaller businesses on our main streets and that sort of thing. There's also a global impact. So we've talked about the McKinsey study, and there is a pretty shocking section in that report that describes sort of the larger economic impacts of this trend of women withdrawing from the workforce. And McKinsey is reporting that if nothing is done to address these gender regressive trends associated with the pandemic, then gross domestic product, which, if anyone needs a refresher on what that is, it's just the total value of goods produced or services provided in a given year. GDP growth could be $1 trillion less 10 years from now than it would have been if women unemployment tracked men. So it's significant, the consequences of this in the long term. And then I think the other thing I want to touch upon is that, we've talked about this already. Women are already significantly outnumbered at the manager level, which means there are fewer women to promote or even hire into these senior management positions. And this is only going to get worse if we don't try to stymie the impact of women withdrawing from the workforce, especially where these senior level women we've seen in some of these figures we looked at today are facing heightened pressure both at work and at home. They are, as I mentioned, 1.5 times more likely than senior level men to think about downsizing or shifting away from their current career. And 3 in 4 of these women are citing burnout as the reason that they want to leave. So that's going to have some pretty negative impacts, across the board if it doesn't change. And change has to happen one organization at a time. So I think that segues into your actual question, Rhoda, which is what can we be doing about this? And Amber, if you could actually turn to slide 10 for this topic. It's actually the very last, yes, great, thank you. It's actually the very last slide in the deck, if you could turn to that one. Yes, thank you, perfect. So there are a couple of things that we can be doing to address this problem. And I want to recognize the fact that some organizations are struggling right now. Business operations are impacted significantly. Maybe resources are tight. Not all of these options that I'm going to talk about today are going to make sense for everyone, for every organization, for every business. But there are going to be sort of a menu of options, and it's not necessary to do all of them. It's great if we can do a few of them, or if we can adopt some initiatives that advance the ball, it's better than doing nothing. So keep that in mind as we talk through some of these things. I don't mean to suggest that every organization should be allowing every employee to work remotely, and every organization should be adopting a paid leave policy or a more generous paid leave policy. Obviously, that's not going to work across the board. There is no universal solution, but those are some of the tools we have in our toolkit where if it does make sense to implement them, the benefits could be huge, and the impact on recruitment and retention of all employees, including female employees, could be tangible. So the first one, and this one really doesn't necessarily impact the bottom line too much, is just to be aware of what's happening within your organization by digging into the data, keeping track of whether there are these gender regressive impacts happening within your own workplace. This is something that is a good idea to do before the pandemic. We should be sort of monitoring these things anyway, but it's especially a good idea to be doing now. So look at job losses and attrition and try to ascertain whether there are higher rates of women leaving as opposed to men. Look at promotion rates. Are there more men or women being promoted? Has there been a change? Hiring, has the pre-COVID balance between the genders been maintained, or has it become skewed? We want to be looking at this not only as applied to the organization as a whole, but it's a good idea for us to be tracking these metrics across each department and across each tenure band. And here's why. You know, if we look at this on a department by department basis, we might notice that one department is standing out and it looks like there's a problem there. We'll want to do a little bit of due diligence and figure out, is there a manager that's not communicating things in an ideal way, creating stress, contributing to burnout? Can we very easily address that through some sensitivity training or, you know, otherwise? Across tenure band, you know, is that something that we can explain, or is this something that we need to be sort of figuring out how COVID-19 is impacting our specific workforce and if there's anything we can do to address it? Sometimes we can't, and that's fine, but it's good to go through that process of evaluating it, being aware of it, and having our eyes wide open to what is going on. We also want to examine flexible work policies. So can we accommodate a part-time program to help people sort of temporarily step back if they need to because their circumstances are challenging? Is that something that is implementable? Are we factoring the pandemic into performance reviews? So if we go about our annual performance reviews like nothing has changed, employees may feel, you know, like their employers are not appreciating or recognizing that they have been working harder, maybe producing less, but they have been working harder to try to make that happen given the unusual circumstances of the past year. We need to be sort of reassessing our performance standards, our expectations. You know, if we want to keep the same performance standards, do we need to reassess the deadlines associated with those standards? Is there anything that needs to change to make the workplace, you know, to make these performance reviews make sense? A lot of employers didn't do performance reviews last year, which, you know, you can't really blame, you know, that type of decision making. It was a very unusual year, but it's a good idea to sort of get on top of that and reassess those metrics going forward, because it's not something you want to leave lagging, especially if you do have to evaluate disciplinary action or performance related decision making. You want to have that documented. We can't ignore it forever. Can we take steps to prevent employee burnout? Is there anything we can do to promote employee wellness? Can we reinvent traditional diversity practices like sponsorship programs or employee resource groups or employee recognition? Again, a lot of this stuff may have fallen off the map last year. We can't have employee recognition lunches. We can't have outings and gatherings. Everything is different. You know, everything around the holidays was different. Oftentimes there are year-end parties, things that bring joy to the workforce and, you know, kind of help reduce some of the isolation that could have been, you know, that is probably being felt by a lot of the workforce couldn't happen. So can we be creative about adapting to our new reality where we're social distancing, where a lot of people are working remotely, and try to reinvigorate those types of initiatives in the workforce? Is there any cultural change that needs to happen? Can we ensure women's representation and inclusion in decision making and in planning? Can we take more steps to address these issues? You know, sometimes it's bite-sized little changes that we could be taking to be more proactive in this regard.
Yes, absolutely. I recently did a few webinars on managing a remote workforce, and we talked about performance reviews, that this is not the year to take a hard line, well, you didn't make the metric, blah, 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 because we had metrics at the beginning of 2020, and after March, a lot of those metrics changed for a lot of people. So even if you just have a conversation about, let's talk about what you did well, you know, how you adjusted to everything, talk about things that we can do next year. To at least have the discussion and have an open discussion, but maybe not have a rating, you know, for the year. Make this the one year you don't have a rating, you just have a discussion about how we survived it, how we got through it, and how we're going to grow it in the following year as well. It's just nothing is normal. Nothing's been normal over the last year. So you can't look at every process you've had in your company as being normal.
I think that's right. And I think it's a really good opportunity for us to find different ways to complement the people we work with and recognize what they are doing well to adapt. It's all about adapting and making changes. And so, you know, if we see people who have done that really well, you know, praising them for it, using them as a model for other teams or groups is a great way to sort of share recognition and increase morale, I think. The other topic I wanted to talk about here is increasing transparency in the workforce. So we know from all of these studies that the unknown and the uncertainty is creating stress for employees. And we know that it's impacting women more than it's impacting men. So is it possible for the organization to share information with employees about the business's financial situation? You know, we're weathering the storm. It's going to be okay. Or, you know, even more vague. Here are our challenges. Here's what's going well. You know, people don't want to feel in the lurch, you know, that their job is at risk. And if we can share limited information about the business to help alleviate some of those concerns, it's really helpful. I think that was especially a problem in the beginning of the pandemic. There was so much concern about, you know, what's going to happen, how long is this going to last, and how does this change existing, you know, business operations and client relationships and revenues, and how do I factor into it? And, you know, what if my employer needs to make hard decisions? Where am I going to fall in that? It's just really crippling to have those types of concerns. I think what we're seeing is that there are employees silently suffering, stressing out about those things. How am I going to make my mortgage payment if something happens to my job? And so if we can keep employees in the loop about, you know, what the company is doing to weather the storm and what changes are being implemented to help be more resilient, I think that'll go a long way to making people feel more comfortable and retaining our employees and keeping them happy and productive to the extent possible. We also want to make sure that we're being open about whatever policies do exist that could be providing support. So oftentimes we have policies spelled out somewhere in a manual or handbook or on the intraweb, and people don't necessarily know about them. A lot of companies now have wellness programs and counseling available and those types of things, and it's not utilized because people just don't know about it. If there's a paid leave policy, then, you know, make sure employees know about it and are encouraged to use it if they need it. And especially if men are availing themselves of paid leave, let's not keep it covert. You know, let's own it. Let's, you know, obviously if it's for a reason associated with a disability or confidentiality, we wouldn't broadcast that, but we should encourage people to use their leave. And managers, if to the extent that they are utilizing leave or flexibility to assume childcare responsibilities or help out with educational responsibilities or that sort of thing, it's good to not do it in secret so that subordinates know it's okay to use these policies and I'm not going to face any negative repercussions if I do. And then the final category is promoting sustainability. Honestly, the whole performance review piece that we talked about really factors into this. If we want, you know, to be looking forward and trying to have a sustainable workforce, we need to sort of adjust and tailor performance reviews so that we're not expecting too much during the pandemic and setting employees up for failure. We need to be making sure that managers are communicating appropriately. There was another slide I had in the deck that's really interesting. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. Okay, Amber, if you could turn to the slide that's right before this one. So this slide is showing various things that companies ask managers to do, like check in weekly with your subordinates to make sure their workload is manageable, check in regarding mental health or well-being, take certain actions to make sure that work-life balance is being achieved for your subordinates, reduce your subordinate scope of work. A lot of companies are asking their managers to do these things, and what this graphic shows is that very few employees are reporting that the managers actually did it. So we need to hold managers accountable, and if we are implementing these initiatives to try to move the needle and make a difference, follow up to ensure that it's actually hitting home and it's working. Are our managers effectively communicating this information? Are our managers proactively communicating with their staff to figure out, what are their obstacles to success, and is that something that can be addressed easily? A classic example would be if we have staff working from home, working remotely, are there very small things like ergonomics or workstation issues that could be addressed with very simple adjustments that we are just not getting at because the right questions aren't asked, or employees don't know that they have resources to turn to sort of make those adjustments. I know not really recognizing whether the pandemic was going to last for more than a few months in the beginning, I was sort of resistant to change my work setup at home. And finally, I said, I need to buy a real work chair and I need to have my monitors at the right height. And once I did that, I now feel very comfortable working at home just as I do when I'm in the office, which is great. And so little tweaks like that can make all the difference. We talked about resetting goals, resetting project scopes and deadlines, if that makes sense. Really just monitoring these benchmarks and criteria and being sensitive to the challenges that the pandemic is posing and making adjustments as necessary, I think is a really good step to take.
And the thing that employers need to be aware of is these managers, a lot of the leaders are having the same problems as their employees. And so they need some help from human resources or for some other leadership in the company to help them figure out how to deal with it themselves and how to help their employees. Because I can see some managers being skittish about saying, I have to ask somebody about their psychological health. I don't know how to do that, and sometimes it could go bad if they don't know how to do that. So they need some training and some support to help them figure out how to support their employees better along this way. And if you're asking people to do things they haven't been trained to do or aren't comfortable to do, they're not going to do it, for sure. Laura, we have a question here from Amber that says, how do we take action without addressing these issues by saying we need to increase our female population, and so we should do X? How do we bring this to the table without turning senior management off on this subject?
This is a great question, and I think the way to frame it is as a more general or broad sustainability issue as opposed to a woman issue. Just sort of highlighting these challenges. They're faced by everyone. It's not just women. We just know that women are impacted worse than men. So if we frame it from a broader standpoint of planning for the future, trying to be sustainable, not knowing, how the pandemic is going to unfold from here. Here are the changes that we can make in order to make sure that our workforce is more sustainable going forward. And it's going to have that ancillary benefit of potentially stymieing some of this gender equality regression that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Good point. Well, we're getting close towards the end of the hour. If there are any questions, let's submit them now. We've been able to keep up with the ones that have come in, but we want to be sure we address any questions any of the participants have at this point. So if there's anything else, go ahead and enter it. We've really talked about a lot today, pretty heavy subjects, a lot of details. There's a lot of data out there, as Laura has given us some really great graphics about that today. And, and as Laura said, we're not saying support women more than you do men, but women are, by the percentages, they've been affected a heck of a lot more over the last year. And we just need to be sure we look out for that. We have a comment, Laura, that says, does this great, and it has. You've shed a lot of light on these topics, and I think given our participants a lot to take back with them today. Any other last-minute questions? Oh, we have one more question here from Sherry. To the point that was just made, how equipped do you feel senior leadership is to provide the guidance to their managers?
That's a good question. I think this is where your HR professionals can come in handy if you're not feeling like your senior management is well equipped to handle these issues. Obviously, there's a lot of research and data that goes behind these principles that are informing what the change should be. And so if that isn't recognized or appreciated or communicated, then it can be hard, I think, to ignite the desire to implement those types of changes. So, communicating that information, encouraging members of leadership to participate in these types of webinars is, potentially a way to do that. But really engaging HR professionals is another way to sort of help get that exposure and get those ideas across.
And as you spoke about earlier, Laura, metrics. We know a lot of our senior people are very data-driven, so this is why you should measure the impact of everyone in your workplace, who's getting promoted, who is leaving, who's coming on board. All of those things go to data, because metrics always tell a very big story to leaders, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So okay. So we have a comment here. If anyone would like SHRM credit for this presentation, reach out to me, Rhoda McVeigh, Rhoda@kmahr.com, and I'll be able to send you the activity code so that you can submit this for probably 1.0 credit, I would imagine, since it's a 1-hour program today. And, you had some really good graphics today, too, Laura. Thank you so much for sharing those, because I know it's not easy to dig through the mountain of information we get every day in our inbox.
Well, I can't take all the credit, Rhoda. You also pulled together a lot of those great graphics, and I probably should plug leanin.org. If any of you have been to one of my presentations in the past on gender equality, I really like to borrow from Lean In. They do a great job visualizing their data. And so we definitely took advantage of that with this presentation and used some of those wonderful figures and graphics to sort of underscore these points we wanted to make.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I guess we are done for today. Thanks again, Laura, for taking time to be with us today. And thank you, Amber, for helping to help host us today as well. We look forward. We have another webinar scheduled with Preti Flaherty in March. I believe it's March 3rd, but I should have looked that up before I got on this today because I forget when it is. But part 2 of this will be in March. So take a look at our website, and we'll be sending out other information as well for part 2 of this type of discussion. So thanks again, everyone, today. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Amber. Have a good rest of the week, everyone, and enjoy the Super Bowl this weekend if you can.
Take care.